Yes?
I get the intellectual part is basically where we're all have gone in as adults. And the emotional bit is probably where children start without any of the intellectual bit.
They do.
But it's the getting them together that's like I find I struggle with, is because I realise a lot of truth and
Here.
yeah,
Yep.
and then sometimes I'll get into the, into this area where the truth and the loving truth marry up, but it's not often. But most of the time, I'm not really willing to be. I don't really understand how to use this experimental stage of being childlike with all truth.
So perhaps we need to discuss more the experiment.
Yeah.
Should we? Okay. So how do we go about experimenting with our life without making a mess of it? Is that the... Too late, it's already done. Yeah. Yeah, that's right. Yeah. It's like, oh, there's a way to experiment without making a mess. Now, it depends what defines a mess too, by the way. So do you want to define a mess as the way the world defines a mess, or do you want to define a mess the way God defines a mess? Well, I don't know about you, but I'd prefer God's, so I'm going to start with God's. So what's God's definition of a mess in terms of you, in terms of an individual being in a mess? Well, what would be the pure state from God's perspective? And then we can see what would be a mess from God's perspective. What would be the pure state? So God's state would be like the person is loving. So the mess from God's perspective, remember, God doesn't have a qualitative judgment of the mess. So God's not saying, you terrible person, you're in a mess. Like, God's aware of how you got into a mess. And most of it wasn't even your problem initially. It was the decisions that you made afterwards. But the mess is unloving person. So what's God's definition of like something that's sane and real? Okay, so we look at truth. So that'd be somebody who's untruthful, isn't it? With self and others. Okay. And what else? God's? Well, yeah, there's some in there, but humble. Let's start with the first three, shall we? So humble. What's this one going to be? A person who's arrogant. What's a person who's arrogant like? Like, okay, they know everything. They think they know better than everyone else. Yeah? What else? Sorry? Honest. So can we say truth is a part of being honest? So let's do that. So a person who God is living in their passions. What would you be living in if you're in a mess? Addictions, okay. And fear, okay. Okay, so God's truth, passion, that's understandable. What else? Desire. What is a person who's in a mess? Living in fear, yeah, rather than desire. What else? Trust, okay. What's a person here? Distrusting. Doubtful, doubting, untrustworthy, often they are too. Okay, what else? Can you see what we're doing? We're constructing a list of what you could be like and constructing a list of what often we are like, basically. Okay, so let's look at that. Now, my suggestion is do this exercise with everything that you can think of, right, as a personal exercise, to list all the things that you think if you were in your pure state, in passion, you were loving and everything, what would you be like? And you can often use your imagination, and you often get a bit of spirit help to imagine what you would be like in that state. Now, Can you see something growing in this list here on this side, on the right-hand side? This is the definition of a mess. Does anybody want to make a comment about that definition of a mess? Jane, you want to start?
So would they be pretty much our mess would be the errors that we have within us that we need to release, like distrust would be one of them. We need to work on our fears.
But let me summarise the whole thing.
Yep.
God already knows you're in a mess. Has that not dawned upon you?
Yeah.
But you don't. Has that not already dawned upon you? You see, what we think as, we would classify, see, if I didn't use that heading and I rubbed that out and I replaced it with another heading, which is called now that's how most people are. You think about it. In the course of an average day, how much does loving emotions drive most of us compared to unloving emotions? It'd be hard to say that loving emotions dominate, wouldn't it, in the course of a day? Like often we're tired, exhausted, you know, feeling quite negative about our work or whatever, particularly if we're in a job that we don't like, and so forth. In the course of a day, how often are you totally truthful with every single person around you? So a person who comes up with to you and they're a bit overbearing. You just go, oh, I find you to be a very overbearing person. You wish you could say that, yeah. But we don't, do we? The reality is we're quite untruthful with almost all of our interactions with people. Now, how many times do we want to believe that we know everything about a subject? Or know a lot of things about a subject? Preferably all the time, isn't it? Pretty much. How many times do we want our addictions met during the day? Like, most of us wake up in the morning and the very first thing we do is usually on our addiction list, right? How much fear do we have in the course of the day? Fear to be a person who does what they desire and all of those kind of things. In the course of a day, it's quite a lot if we analyse it. How often are we very mistrustful of every single person around? Oh, don't trust that person. Don't trust that person. And that character who says he's Jesus, I definitely do not trust that person. Right? So this is what happens. This is normal. This is what most of us classify as normal. But God sees that as a mess. This is all facade. It's all creating a person we're not created to be. We're in this place. This is the place God would love to see us in. And to be honest, isn't it the place where most of us would love to see ourselves in? Like, even if God wasn't in your life, wouldn't you want to be a person who's loving, truthful, humble? You know, those kind of people, very, very easy to be with. You know, you can spend a whole day with them and not get angry. Except when they tell you the truth. And then they might get angry. So that's the reality of life, is that what we view as normal, God sees as, well, that's a bit crazy, actually. That kind of lifestyle, crazy. Why do you want that for? Is the way God sees that, right? Now, God's given you the will, the free will, to make the choice to have that life, if that's what you wish. But can you see that as soon as we start confronting this, we're going to have to start changing our viewpoint of what is normal? You can see that, can't you? We've got to change our viewpoint from something that we believe is a normal way of looking at life into something that is a very, very different way of looking at life, which is what I feel is God's view of normal. That's normal from God's perspective. This is normal from man's perspective. Now, obviously, in the process of confronting that, we are going to end up with confronting a lot of the people around us as well, because, you know, the guy who's all needy and comes up to me and he's quite overbearing, and you say to him, I actually find you quite overbearing. He's going to be confronted by that truth, is he not? Right? He's going to feel something as a result. And a lot of times we're not prepared to bite off the results of that, and so we don't engage things truthfully. That being the case, though, you also know that if a person is truthful, even when it's hard to be truthful, you can trust them a lot, can't you? If you're with a person who, you know, slips out of this one with a little white lie there and slips out of that one with a little thing here and does a heap of things behind your back because they don't want to tell you to the face and whatever, do you finish up trusting them very much? Of course not. Right? It's a consequence. It's a result of It's a result of what we view as normal, but it's not what God views as normal. Now, that being the case, so let's redefine that to what it was before. That being the case, why would we ever want to remain how we have been? Fear. There can only be one reason, can't there? Really. There's no other reason other than fear as to why we would want to stay in that place. Like when we look at that place, we go, oh, I don't want that, I don't want that, I don't want that. If we look at that place without any fear of how other people will think of us, any fear about our partner and whether they're going to leave us or not, any fear about our friends and whether they're going to think we're an idiot or not, like if we looked at that place, we'd go, no, that's not what I want to be. Right? We'd look at that place and go, yes, that's the kind of thing I'd want to be. I want to be that kind of person. Of course, I also want to be this kind of person. Wouldn't I? All of these things we could put on the list down here and list what the opposite is down here. And when we look at our life honestly, can we not see that a lot of times we've got this list going full on and this list is barely on our radar? And what we're going to need to do at some point is to confront within ourselves our fear. Because without confronting our fear, we're not going to change. Right? And we need to change. The whole world needs to change, and the only way the world's going to change is by individuals changing. So we need to change if we want to change. If we want to be happy, we need to change. Right? And that's going to mean letting go of the mess. Unfortunately, though, we have our sense of worth from this mess. Because we've been taught over many, many years to be so invested in the person we've become, we now have a terrible investment in terms of our sense of worth. Every time we give up one of these things, we think we're giving up ourselves somehow. From God's perspective, every time you give up one of those things, you're becoming yourself somehow. But from our perspective, every time we give up one of these things, we're losing ourselves somehow. And this is the challenge that we face. Our concept of what is normal needs to be adjusted. Last week in Adelaide, I gave a little half an hour talk at the end of our presentation in Adelaide about normal. Yeah. Normal from our perspective and normal from God's perspective, two very, very different things. And we need to change our concept of normal. You see, it's our concept of normal, which is actually a mess. It is a problem because we don't know we're in a mess. We view it as normal. Our concept of normal needs to change. So for many of us in our relationships, our concept of normal needs to change. Because for many of us in our relationships, there's addictions where one person does everything for the other person in the relationship and the other person hardly does anything. That's an addiction. In a relationship that's balanced and loving, two people would equally love each other. They would have a desire to please each other, a desire to engage each other emotionally, physically, sexually, and so forth. That's what would be normal if we had it in this column. But what's normal for most people on the planet is, you know, to have emotional bargains, to have sexual bargains, to have physical bargains. You know, one person does all of one job, the other person never does it. The other person goes to work, but the other person never goes to work. We see all of these addictions in play because they suit our sense of worth. And until we're willing to confront them, nothing can change in our relationship. And the same applies to outside of the relationship, in our relationships with our colleagues, our workmates, our businesses, our life, our whole life, and our relationship with God. This is something that we need to address if we want to be happy. Yes. Sorry.
Yeah, I was in Adelaide last week, and after hearing the discussion, in 1 week I've learned like an amazing amount about what we're just talking about. Like, I thought I had a soulmate, and we'd had discussions about it, and I sort of realised that I didn't actually, not with this particular person, and they were just coming and coming and coming and still saying to me, "You're soulmate." I knew internally and didn't end it. And I was living not very humble, not in truth, and not being loving to them because I knew, and yet I couldn't sit down and have the discussion because I felt I was being loving because I didn't tell her, because I didn't want to hurt her feelings. And it was killing me. And it was probably the best thing to have that discussion that we just had there last week, because it changed everything about what I'm doing now. So I understand, and I put a few things straight in the last week.
And that's the power of truth, isn't it, Glenn? Right?
The truth was amazing. The difference in her is just amazing, over the moon. And I mean, from throwing things at me too, but a couple of days later she came back and said thanks for putting it on the right track and telling the truth, because she said she felt she wouldn't have seen it.
Now, I didn't answer the other question completely. So can you remember what the original question was that caused me to go into this?
I don't know. Yeah, it was how do we get from this intellectual state of knowing God's truth to experiment with it that way, to make it a feeling and an experience of the truth?
Okay. So the key is, how do we begin this experiment? Like, to begin any experiment, you've got to start at the point that you know. It's like scientists know this, right? So what they do is they construct experiments that extend their knowledge beyond what they currently know. Is that not true? That's how scientists do their experiments, yes? So what we need to do is the same thing, okay? So let's assume that this mess that God sees us in, that we believe is fine, that we believe is all good, let's assume that that for a moment that it might be a mess, but we've got to prove it, don't we? We've got to prove that it's a mess. So what would we do? Well, what we do is we choose one subject. So let's choose truth. And we make an experiment. What would the experiment be, do you think? Pretty simple experiment. Speak the truth every single moment to every single person for 1 week. The feelings that you actually feel. Speak the truth every single moment, every single person for 1 week. Boss, like, you've seen like dramas about this, right? Have you not? Where a person has to do this and you see their life go into turmoil. You know, what's that one with Jim Carrey? Liar, liar? Yeah? Try that for a week. Now, already before we begin, what do we notice? Okay. Fear. This is just one experiment. We've got others to do yet. All these others to do. This is just one experiment. Right? 1 week, one experiment. Now, could you design an experiment that allows you to do that? Of course, quite simple, isn't it? I'm going to speak. What do I feel? This is what I'm going to say. So what do I feel about Mary? She's my partner, right? What do I feel about her? And I'm going to tell Mary exactly what I feel. Good and not so good. I'm not going to edit it like I always done before, you know, like I noticed before there's certain things that maybe I don't like, but I don't tell her. Because I know she'll be upset. So when she comes up and says, does my bum look big in these jeans? I go, yeah, darling, if that's what I felt. Right. And Mary knows that. Anyway, we've got a running joke about that in our relationship. Because I say, yes, darling, you've got a size 22 backside. Which, of course, she hasn't got. But, yeah. But if we be truthful and see what happens, that's the experiment. See what happens. Now, you will find in that experiment a lot of very amazing things. People who you thought liked you don't like you at all. People who you thought you could get away with saying anything to, you can't. People who you thought were loving in all circumstances and situations are not loving in the situation of receiving truth. People, and I'm not saying to do it in an angry way, because you'd want to do this, you'd want to engage it in a loving way, wouldn't you, if you did this? So I'm not saying it, you'd engage it to punish somebody or to, do anything. It's just an experiment of experimenting with truth and its power in your life. Yeah. Engage it for the whole week. Now, if you're in a relationship, you will actually find if you engage truth in a loving manner, there's only two possible outcomes. Your relationship will get closer, that's outcome number one, or your relationship will break up very rapidly, that's number two. That's the only possible two outcomes. And if you engage truth at work, there's only two possible outcomes. You'll get exactly the job you want and doing exactly what you want to do, or you'll get sacked. That's what you'll find. It's a great experiment, but you've got to be willing to address the fear, yes? It requires courage, doesn't it, to do that. Now, that's only one experiment. So you could engage in other experiments. So let's say the truth experiment is far too confronting for the first one. So we rub that one out. We don't do that one. There's just too much fear there for us to engage that one. Which one would you prefer to engage? Let's go for desire. Desire seems to win. So let's go for desires. Okay. What's the opposite of desire? Yeah, interesting. You thought that one wouldn't be very confronting. It's one of the most confronting ones you can imagine. So that means this week I could construct an experiment where I only do what I desire and I don't do anything else. Half of you won't go to work this week, so you still end up getting the sack. But can you see how, again, it can be you can design some experiments associated with that. And when I say experiments, experiment with your desire. What are my desires? What do I really like doing? So go and do something. How many of you guys have been dancing? Yeah? How many of you have been ballroom dancing? A few. How many of you liked it? Yeah. Okay. So a few. This is great, is it? So that if you've never been, how do you know? Almost pretty much everybody who goes likes it, right? So if you've never gone, you don't really know whether you'd like it or not. Is that not true? So why don't you 1 week, at least, enroll in a 10-week? Well, usually they don't have 1 week courses, unfortunately. So you have to enroll in a 10-week course and go dancing. Go ballroom dancing. Got a partner, take her with you if she'd like to come. And experiment with that. Engage it without fear. And let yourself feel your fears come up. The fear that, I trip over my foot all the time, that fear will come up. There's other fears that will come out. Oh, what do I look like in front of all these people? And then there's another fear, the guy comes along, who's the instructor, taps on the shoulder. You're not doing it very good, actually. This is how you need to do it. And you feel all terrible inside, because you can't do it right in the first time you're doing it. And there's all these other fears that come up just by you engaging a process, just a simple process, 1 hour a week or something like that. So what else could you do in terms of experimenting with desire? See, you could also experiment with fear, couldn't you? So how would you do that? Well, yeah, it's a very passive thing. That's in the sense, it's like, please God, show me how to deal with my fears, and then you sit down at home, and don't go anywhere. It's a very passive thing, right?
I tried abseiling to cure my fear of heights.
So abseiling to cure your feelings of height, did it cure them?
No.
No, of course it doesn't. Because your fear of heights has got nothing to do with heights, actually. But you need to experiment with that. And see, now that you've experimented by going abseiling, you know that actually abseiling doesn't cure my fear of heights. So there's one thing I can scratch off the list for the next thing to do to cure my feeling of fear of heights, right? I can say, right, I've tried that didn't work. Twice. So we make a choice, we follow it through, end up with it, and the result is, no, it didn't cure my fear of heights. So scratch that off the list. Obviously, my fear of heights isn't related to heights. So that tells me a great deal about my fear of heights. Does that make sense? So that then means I need to construct some kind of other experiment with links somehow. So for example, what does my mum feel about heights? That'd be an interesting question to experiment with, if she's alive. Any other ways that we could address our fears? Not far away. You want to use the mic? Can we use the mic so I can hear you?
Oh.
Probably. Yeah.
Fear of the dark.
Fear of the dark, okay. So have you found that when you sit in the dark and turn off the lights and you sit there shaking, whatever, the very next night it's exactly the same. If you turn off the lights and shake, whatever. But you can experiment with that and at least say, okay, my fear of the dark is not related to the dark, if you experiment with it. But if you don't experiment, you don't know whether your fear of dark is related to the dark or related to something else. It could be related to the fact that you can't see things in the dark.
Yes, going outside at night in the dark, you know.
Going outside at night, yeah. So it could be more related to the fear of what people in the dark might do to you. There's all sorts of things that it could be related to, not just the fear of the dark. It could also be related to how your mother viewed the dark when she was young. What happened to her in the dark when she was young. There's all sorts of relationships that we need to explore and experiment. But if we don't do the experiment, we'll never know. Yep.
So what's the purpose of the experiment? I'm getting a bit lost, Joy.
If you say the comment on the thing, Mark, in the mic.
So we're talking about the experiments, but what's the purpose? What are we trying to do here?
What we're trying to do is become more loving. That's the underlying goal, and more happy, is it not? The beauty of any experiment that confronts us emotionally is that we will eventually release something emotionally that will be gone from us completely, and then we'll be left with only emotions that are positive and that don't harm us, and that are not defined by fear or addictions. In other words, we'll get closer to God, closer to ourselves, and closer to happiness if we confront these addictions. And the experimentation, remember when I drew the original table at the top, on both sides I said anything we don't know the truth about needs to be experimented with. Right? So this is also a way for us to determine the truth. That's the whole point of the experiment. It's how do we determine the truth? So in the experiment of abseiling to see whether you fear of heights, you learned one primary thing, and that is when you're up high and felt your feelings, you're still afraid of heights. So you've gone through that process, but you're still afraid of heights. You go through the process again, and you're still afraid of heights. So obviously this abseiling thing isn't the cure of the fear of heights. There's something else going on. And so you learn the truth. You learn more about the truth every time you create the experiment. This is also something that's really important to understand, is this is about taking responsibility for your own life and your own happiness. You see, if you expect other people to do the experiments for you, and then you just sit back and relax, waiting for them to tell you the answers to these experiments, do you think that inside of yourself, your own feelings will change? Of course they won't. Because for your feelings to change, you're going to have to feel something for your feelings to change.